Bien, je crois que nous pouvons commencer cette séance d'aujourd'hui. Je suis heureux d'accueillir Daniel Peterson. La séance sera une séance bilingue, l'intervenant Daniel s'exprimant en anglais et les participants pouvant poser leurs questions en français et ainsi établir un échange avec notre invité. Daniel, je vous remercie d'intervenir aujourd'hui. Je vais vous passer la parole et comme nous en avions convenu, vous allez commencer par vous présenter, puisque jusqu'à présent, nous ne vous connaissions pas et c'est grâce à Elsa Lafaille de Michaud que nous avons pris contact avec vous et également par la lecture de la revue Mousson dans laquelle le travail que vous allez exposer maintenant a été publié en 2023, je crois.
Mhm.
Merci, Daniel.
Oui, merci Thierry for the invitation. And I understand it's typical or standard protocol to deliver these presentations in French, but my French is not really up to that, so I'm going to proceed in English. As Thierry said, today my presentation, the title derives, excuse me, the title China's Power Play in Indonesia, Infrastructure, Investment, and Territorial Incursions. It derives from, as Thierry said, an article that I researched and wrote in the latter half of 2021 and then 2022, and it was published in Mousson as part of a bilingual special edition on China's influence in Southeast Asia. That research, owing to the pandemic, I interviewed around 30 specialists of the Indonesia-China relationship, primarily via Zoom, again, owing to the pandemic. And respondents included former politicians, diplomats, academics, journalists, think tank analysts. Um, and those interviews provided me with a very rich evidence base on which to write this particular article and several others. Um, the interesting thing is that recent developments in Indonesia-China relations, which I'll get to, have given me a reason to revisit those transcripts. In particular, the sort of better, more informed people with closer, sort of more intimate knowledge of the relationship and certain power dynamics between Indonesian and Chinese political elites. Um, so those developments I referred to are Indonesia's uh, newly elected president, Prabowo Subianto, who was elected on Valentine's Day of last year and was inaugurated on the 20th of October last year. His first official state visit as president was to Beijing on the 8th of November. As you can see these photos of Prabowo being given the tour by President Xi Jinping. Um, there were positive results for Indonesia in terms of commitments in terms of Chinese investment, but also a joint statement released by the Chinese Communist Party on behalf of both countries. And that statement appeared to reflect a change in Indonesian foreign policy in terms of, excuse me, um, in terms of its approach to what it has termed since July 2017, the North Natuna Sea. To those not familiar with this term or name, it simply refers to Indonesia's exclusive economic zone, its maritime sovereignty within the South China Sea. And it was a result of this visit that there appears to be, for the first time in recent memory anyway, an Indonesian president who is acknowledging that Indonesia and China have overlapping claims uh, in the South China Sea, namely over Indonesia's North Natuna Sea. Heretofore, Indonesia simply refused to indulge China's claims over what, according to international law, is Indonesian maritime territory. So, as I said, these developments gave me reason to sort of pause and revisit these transcripts. What I initially felt was at the time this joint statement was released that perhaps this is just simply an Indonesian president who's saying, yes, we're going to actually acknowledge that China is claiming parts of our maritime territory. That is one potential option. The other, having consulted with a few colleagues in the past few weeks, is that it could be that Indonesia and China, or that Prabowo actually attempts or intends, I should say, to um, strike a deal, so to speak, with China, with Xi Jinping, such that the two countries collaborate in some form of joint exploitation of the natural resources in that particular maritime territory. So, as I proceed with this presentation, when I get to this, you'll have a better understanding of why my suspicions have grown with regard to well, that working hypothesis. So I'm going to briefly just address the notion of Chinese economic statecraft vis-a-vis Indonesia, and then going to look at the fallout of Prabowo's November visit to Beijing in greater depth. And then I'm going to sort of dig deep into this working hypothesis. And what I think is that, in fact, it's not as outlandish or what's the word? Not as outlandish or uh, wild an idea, because in fact, there is evidence that precedes all this. If we look through, um, you know, developments under at least under Prabowo's predecessor, President Joko Widodo. Just to dispense with some formalities, if we're talking about Chinese economic statecraft, there are many definitions out there. For present purposes, I'm going to use James Riley's from his book Orchestration. And Riley simply writes that economic statecraft is when political leaders intentionally use economic resources to exert influence in pursuit of foreign policy objectives. It is distinguished from commercially motivated actions by its political objectives, the pursuit of power rather than plenty. Ultimately, economic statecraft is an influence attempt, an exercise of power. What, however, might distinguish other countries' economic statecraft from China's is something that Elizabeth Economy addresses in her book, The Third Revolution, where she writes that the Chinese Communist Party encourages its state-owned enterprises to undertake investments in high-risk economies that no other country or multinational would advance in support of its Belt and Road Initiative. So decisions that appear irrational in the context of liberal political systems and market-based economies in the near term, thus often possess a longer-term strategic logic with China. This is another way of simply saying that while investments that China makes in countries such as Indonesia might not have an immediate return on investment or might not appear to be a good investment, an economically sound investment, is not at the forefront of Chinese decision makers' minds when they make these decisions. Rather, they are looking for opportunities to invest that will grant them long-term access to a country such as Indonesia. And this is all about not just soft power, but just simply having boots on the ground, so to speak. Chinese nationals working on projects that give the CCP access to these countries over a long period of time. To give you an idea of how much Indonesia, excuse me, how much Indonesia is in China's crosshairs, so to speak. Um, this study, which was published in September of 2021 by AidData. AidData is a research lab at William and Mary College in Virginia in the United States. It is, to my knowledge, the most comprehensive undertaking of understanding China's Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese infrastructure investment globally. It is limited, as any study is. So, as I say here, the data set tracks projects over 18 commitment years. So 2000 to 2017 is the time frame we're dealing with. Um, and that includes projects that will be implemented over a 22-year period. Um, so the time frame we're concerned with is 2000 to 2017, but then projects that will be implemented potentially until 2021. So as you can see, there are close to 13,500 projects that the study identifies, collectively worth $843.1 billion. They also identify certain projects that were suspended, cancelled, didn't actually get off the ground. Um, it doesn't obviously capture Chinese investment in Indonesia post 2017, but I will address that after. The reason I cite this study frequently is just to give a broad picture sense. So if we look here, in between 2000 and 2017, Indonesia was the fourth largest recipient of official development assistance from China. Um, that is, and they define this as aid is a grant, it has a grant element of more than 25%, and there is a development intent with the money invested. So you can see Indonesia number four. As I've shown my students before, the reason I've highlighted these other Southeast Asian countries is to give you a sense also of China's intent in the Southeast Asian region. So Myanmar, Cambodia, and Vietnam have also been targets and recipients of development aid from China. Then we look at debt, and this is obviously far more significant in terms of the fact that China will expect to recoup what it has granted, I should say. And so debt typically is a grant element of less than 25% and or no development intent. So simply money typically issued by China's development banks, China's policy banks. So Indonesia number six there with 29.96 billion, again, between 2000 and 2017. Interestingly, this report also revealed that Indonesia at the time, the report went to publication in September of 21, that Indonesia had a $17.28 billion debt off the books. So this is simply Indonesian state-owned enterprises collectively owing China $17.28 billion. And this is something that is off the government ledger, that is not backed by a sovereign guarantee, but nevertheless is something that China will ultimately one day seek to recoup. If we look at specific Belt and Road infrastructure projects that were underway, you can see Indonesia is number two, $20.3 billion spent or invested, I should say. And then in terms of project counts, Indonesia is joint second with Pakistan, second only to Cambodia. But you'll note that those projects that China has invested in Indonesia, the value of that far outweighs anything that China has invested in Cambodia. What types of projects are we talking about? Well, things like these. So the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, which was finally inaugurated on the 2nd of October 2023. The Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail is a lesson in how not to plan and build a high-speed rail. It was disaster after disaster in terms of financing, in terms of debt restructuring, in terms of acquiring the land to build the railway on it in the first place. The Morowali Industrial Park is one of Indonesia and China's flagship nickel mining, smeltering joint ventures. It has also been responsible for significant degrees of environmental degradation, devastation in central Sulawesi, where it is located. I think just before Christmas in 2023 as well, there was an explosion that killed a number of employees. So there have been serious OH&S problems with it. And then finally, the Kayan Cascade hydropower project in North Kalimantan, which is worth around $17.8 billion. China has invested that much. The plan is that they hope it will generate around 9,000 megawatts of electricity, much of which will power the new Indonesian capital currently under construction, just south in East Kalimantan. But again, this is um, a project that is picked to be on foot for a good 30 years. So again, granting Chinese nationals access to Indonesia for a protracted period of time. So earlier I said that report is not particularly, obviously it stops at 2017. These are official stats. I should flag from the outset, it is really difficult at times to identify just how much um, China is investing in any given country, but in Indonesia, obviously my country of focus. And some stats conflict. These are from um, Indonesia's Ministry of Investment and Downstream Industry, BKPM. Um, this is billions of US dollars. So initially it starts out at 173.64 million, and obviously the figures increase, particularly after 2013 when Indonesia signed onto China's Belt and Road Initiative. That last figure is just up until June of last year, but as I'll show you in a second, the investment is still around 8 point something or other billion. But that just gives you an idea of how much. Obviously, investment went down during the pandemic and then shot straight back up thereafter. Um, and that is just last year. This is again official state figures. So number three, Tiongkok, is the People's Republic of China, and you can see 8.1 odd billion invested alone by China in Indonesia last year. And that's around 21,464 projects that, so you can see there's been a huge increase in the number of projects that China has invested in. The other thing, there are two things here with these statistics. The first is to note, yes, Singapore and Hong Kong appear to be the two largest investors. Having spoken with people and having done my own research, um, often what is happening here is there's a lot of evidence to suggest China is the number one investor in Indonesia. It will use Singapore and Hong Kong as kind of tax havens to round trip, so to speak, its investment. There are other political reasons that it might also be doing this. Indonesia obviously has a history of persecuting ethnic Chinese Indonesians. Um, the government is acutely aware of this. A lot of the time, any kind of investment made by China, um, I think Indonesian politicians would be lying to say they weren't aware of the fact that too much investment might be perceived by certain sections of Indonesia's population as a Chinese takeover. And so this is what arguably is one of the reasons that they are round tripping this money through Singapore and Hong Kong. Tax holidays, etc., is another possibility, but again, there is a need to sort of manage that sensitivity around ethnic Chinese populations, etc. Um, Also because, well, ethnic Chinese population of Indonesia is around 5% of the population, and yet they do hold a significant amount of the country's wealth, um, relatively. The other point is to note that you'll see number five, the United States, six, Japan, seven, South Korea, eight is the Netherlands, 10 is the United Kingdom, 11 is Australia, etc. These countries are well behind in terms of what they're investing in Indonesia as compared to China. Um, this could be significant in the long term. Indonesia typically takes the position of we are open for business, we have a free and active foreign policy, we don't discriminate. As Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono said, we want to have zero enemies and 1,000 friends or something to that effect. Um, Indonesia will say we're open for business. And Joko Widodo, the former president, his right-hand man, Luhut Panjaitan, who I'll discuss shortly, they, as they've told several of my respondents, sorry, told me, these men are quite happy to play countries off one another. So they would openly say to the Americans, well, the Chinese have given us this much. How much are you going to give us? They understand they're in a position of, um, you know, they understand they're at the center, quite literally the centerpiece of the Indo-Pacific region. They understand how important they are geopolitically, geostrategically. And it's for these reasons that they are able to, in their minds, take money from China and then use that to try and encourage investment from the United States, from the Anglosphere, from Western Europe. Um, the overriding point is, I think, if we want to balance out China's influence in Indonesia, then Western countries need to step up and invest more than they're currently doing. This gives you a sense just of what, in terms of what China is investing its money primarily in Indonesia. So, Indonesia State Investment Board last year revealed these figures. The primary focus China has on Indonesia is nickel and basic metals, other basic metals. Indonesia is the world's largest repository of nickel. It has around 22% of the world's nickel deposits, and China has an energy deficit. Quite literally needs to keep the lights on for 1.3, 1.4 billion people. And so it's a relationship of convenience and something that Indonesia is happy to cash in on. Also, two-way trade has never been stronger between the two countries. It dropped slightly in 2023, but this was attributed to an adjustment in global commodity prices. Um, but at the bilateral level, the trade level, the two countries have never enjoyed a stronger relationship. There are also recent pledges by China during a visit to China. Jokowi and his wife there, as you can see in that photo, Iriana. Um, China committed 44.89 billion in further investments. Less than 2 months later, Chinese Premier Li Qiang confirmed another investment pledge of 21.7 billion. So more and more promises of money to Indonesia. You need to keep in mind, however, that while it does this, China is also being quite brash about um, how it, is going to approach things in the South China Sea. So, ironically, 23rd of August here, 2023, Xi says hegemonism is not in China's DNA. 5 days later, China's Ministry of Natural Resources issues a new map that replaces the 9-dash line with a map of a 10-dash line, which incorporates all of Taiwan and even waters along the coast of Borneo. So look at what it does, not what its head of state says is the lesson. Now, excuse me. This is the visit I raised at the beginning. So China received President Prabowo on the 8th of November. Indonesian and Chinese businesses signed agreements worth around $10 billion following this. There were talks of even greater security and defense cooperation between the two countries, something that Indonesia's military will likely struggle with at times, I think, because of long-standing distrust of China, which dates back to 1965. Um, but as I said earlier as well, the biggest surprise from this meeting, or this visit, I should say, was the release of this 16-page joint statement. The content of the joint statement is rather benign. It's, just standard diplomatic speak, pledges to increase cooperation, etc. Until we get to page 10, the first paragraph of which says the two sides reached important common understanding on joint development in areas of overlapping claims. Again, this is unprecedented. The fact that Indonesia, which simply renamed its part of the South China Sea in July 2017, the North Natuna Sea, is for the first time now acknowledging with China that they have overlapping claims over Indonesian waters is a significant shift in Indonesian foreign policy. This is something that blindsided the Indonesian Foreign Ministry and the Indonesian military, both of which said they had no knowledge of this So this shows you how Prabowo is really the foreign policy pre and how he is planning to essentially make at times unilateral decisions. When this initially happened, my reaction was to just wait and let the dust settle, so to speak. A lot of people got very fired up and worked up about this. If you read certain people who've written on this, Emir Shailendra is one example. His research found, talking to people in Jakarta in 2022, there was already talk under President Jokowi to change Indonesia's approach. That is to say, we can't continue to just ignore the elephant in the room. We can't continue to ignore the fact that um, China continues to intrude on our maritime sovereignty territory. Um, and so one school of thought says, well, Indonesia is simply finally confronting this rather than just, reverting to potentially backroom diplomacy and not making a scene about this. I then consulted more recently several people, commentators, scholars, etc. One in particular who said, no, no, no. I think, in fact, Prabowo is trying to strike a deal with Xi, with China. A colleague I spoke with recently even suggested, if you recall that $17.28 billion of debt that the aid data report revealed, it could be in part to do with that. It could be in part Prabowo's way of discharging some of that debt in terms of if we agree to actually exploit the natural resources of the North Natuna Sea in a joint manner, then great. But it also could be for another reason, which I'm going to get to now. So you can see there the red little part. That is what is the overlapping claims. That's the disputed territory. So China's 9 or 10 dash line captures that part of Indonesia's maritime territory. Interestingly, that joint statement made no reference to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Indonesia didn't release the document, which I thought at the time might suggest that, okay, well, Indonesia has not necessarily agreed or acceded to what is contained in the joint statement. Um, but that's one option. The other option is simply that Prabowo was either a little bit sloppy almost, shall we say, um, and he didn't brief his foreign minister or the foreign ministry, and he didn't brief the military on this. Rather, he made this unilateral decision during the visit. Interestingly, the Chinese language version of the joint statement is actually more emphatic. It says the two sides reached important consensus on carrying out joint development in the overlapping waters claimed by the two countries. Um, it's far less equivocal than the English language version. Now, the reason I think my working hypothesis is that essentially that we might see a joint exploitation, a collaboration over exploiting Indonesia's natural resources there is going back, as I said, to these interview transcripts and looking at even President Jokowi's first term. Under his first, during his first term, I should say, his Minister of Maritime Affairs and Fisheries was this woman off to the left, just stretching her quads out, Susi Pujiastuti. Susi was a very principled, scrupulous minister, and she understood that her mandate was to, at all costs, defend and protect Indonesian maritime sovereignty. Her boss and her boss's right-hand man, Luhut Panjaitan, that man to the left of the president in that photo, had other ideas. Susie had this rather performative way of dealing with illegal fishing boats. As you can see in that photo, she would simply direct her um, the Coast Guard, the military, the Navy to just sink them, to blow them up. Um, After, of course, apprehending and arresting the fishermen on board. By the end of her 5 years as minister, you can see she'd sunk 556 illegal boats. Now, this article, from memory, was an Antara article. But you can see there that yes, Antara, she sunk 321 Vietnamese boats, 91 Filipino, 87 Malaysian, 24 Thai, two Papua New Guinean, one from Nigeria, one from Belize, and only three from China. Now, as a point of reference, between the 19th and 24th of December 2019, 63 Chinese fishing vessels, escorted by China's Coast Guard, entered um, Indonesia's North Natuna Sea. If that is a point of reference, how was it that she only sank three boats, three Chinese vessels that violated um, UNCLOS, that violated international law and intruded on Indonesian maritime sovereignty? So this particular case, we could almost refer to, or I do, as a line in the sand. 19th of March 2016, Indonesian naval authorities detained a Chinese trawler, the Kwai Fei. They arrested the eight Chinese fishermen on board for stealing fish in Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. That Chinese trawler was intercepted 68 nautical miles from the northeast of North Natuna, which is Indonesia's northernmost island. And that vessel was 420 nautical miles from China's Hainan Island, the southernmost point of China. So it's a long way from home. China's excuse has always been that we are simply fishing in what we consider to be our traditional fishing grounds. Um, so they arrest the men on board, they detain the boat, and then 11 hours later, while bringing the boat to Natuna Besar, which is within Indonesia's 12 nautical mile territorial waters, distinct from its exclusive economic zone, the China Coast Guard appeared and rammed the Chinese fishing boat under Indonesian detention. And then 30 minutes later, a larger, heavily armed China Coast Guard craft arrived. And it gave the Indonesians no other option but to release the vessel. Interestingly, they didn't demand the return of the eight Chinese fishermen. Um, but this is often the way that China Coast Guard vessels will be the equivalent of an Indonesian naval vessel. But officially, as a Coast Guard vessel rather than naval vessel, it's a civil vessel. Okay, it's not a military vessel. So China's very canny when it comes to exploiting certain loopholes in UNCLOS and the like. Um, this really should have been a line in the sand moment. Instead, and at the time, there were editorials published in the Jakarta Post and Tempo, which is Indonesia's Time magazine equivalent, um, imploring the president to take a stronger stance. A lot of the commentary that came out from academics and analysts was to label this response, which Indonesia didn't really do much. They simply, you might recall this photo here. This was the show of strength was to go out into the North Natuna Sea, the president and his right-hand man Luhut, as a show of strength and just have a presence there. But that was it. They didn't really do anything. There was no condemnation from the Indonesian side, emphatic condemnation of what had happened. And so finally, to get to my, as I promised, my interview transcripts, I interviewed 30 specialists, some of who were very close to people involved, decision makers. And one of them was Susi Pujiastutis, let's just say a very close staffer of the ministers. And I said, why wasn't more done? I asked her, why wasn't more done about this particular case and in general? And her response was, because it's not a priority. So Susi was seen as a block for getting any Chinese deals because China was always asking that a part of the deal was we want to fish in your seas. And Susi said, no, we don't want that. So this respondent said, so China lobbies everywhere, including Yusuf Kala, who was Indonesia's then vice president, and Yusuf Wanandi, who is a very um, high profile, notable ethnic Chinese Indonesian, founder of CSIS Jakarta, the think tank. So China lobbies everywhere, she said, including Yusuf Kala, Yusuf Wanandi. They're there too. She said, okay, we had a lot of enemies. That is in the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Fisheries. We had a lot of enemies because from the vice president, from Luhut, from the coordinating minister of the economy, from all of the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce, or the National Committee of Economy and Industry. They really hated Susie's policy because we were a blocker to a lot of things. And then she paused and I said, Chinese money? I said, I can guess, I can guess. You don't have to say anything, I can guess. And she just nodded. And then later she said, under Susie's successor, Eddie Prabowo, who was then struck off for a corruption case, but then Sakti Trenggono, who is currently the minister, um, she made the point that the function of the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Fisheries used to be paralyzed by money. So you don't need a high-performing minister, i.e., someone like Susi. It's so that people don't know a lot, so that people can do business on the side. There's a lot of money in fish, she told me. Now, what is she talking about? There's a lot of money in fish. Well, this point was affirmed later. I can disclose this particular interview respondent because he agreed that I could publish excerpts of our interview in a handbook, the link to which I've included there. It's actually open access, so if you're curious to read the entire interview, you can online for free. But Faisal Basri he sadly passed away last year, but I was fortunate enough to interview him in November 2021 for a good 2 hours via Zoom. Um, and he was an incredibly decent man, an incredibly generous man with his time, an incredibly principled man. And he told me that he also worked for Susi Pujiastuti. Um, and he said, at that time, Susi was very tight on state sovereignty. He said there was a special monitor in her office and in the workroom displaying the movement of all vessels in Indonesia in real time. He said it showed the Chinese vessels. He said a lot were captured. He doesn't mean Chinese vessels. He means um, vessels from other countries, predominantly Vietnam, as that article demonstrated. But he said, you may have heard in the news that Chinese vessels were captured, but it never happened. Chinese fishing vessels were safeguarded by their coast guard when they would enter the Natuna waters. So they would be escorted by ships that were the equivalent of Indonesian naval ships. Every time they were escorted by China Coast Guard vessels. Um, So this is my concern. This is our sovereignty, and there is a large oil and gas reserve there, and China is very aggressive in the South China Sea. And he said, I was worried we'd be forced into a compromise because Susi and Luhut used to fight a lot. They would argue amongst themselves. Cabinet meetings would become heated with the two ministers debating. He said Luhut wanted Chinese vessels to be permitted to enter. Now, why would the equivalent of Indonesia's prime minister, the president's right-hand man, want Chinese vessels to enter or be permitted to enter Indonesian waters? So, while interviewing um, one of Indonesia's preeminent sinologist, China experts, who was also himself a journalist based in Hong Kong and Taiwan for extended periods, he told me, go to the OJK website. OJK is Indonesia's financial authority. And he said between 2016 and 2017, China agreed to provide a $3 billion loan distributed among three state banks, Mandiri, BRI, and BNI. BRI is the Indonesian People's Bank, BNI is the Indonesian National Bank. The Indonesian National Bank, coincidentally, was established by Prabowo's grandfather. He said, then there's another fee. From that figure, 500 million was credited to Bosowa, Yusuf Kala's company. Yusuf Kala is, of course, Indonesia's vice president. And then he said another 300 million was distributed as credit to Toba Sejahtera. Who owns Toba Sejahtera? Luhut Binsar Panjaitan. He said this is actually all the background that explains why we are so close with China. So there is Luhut on the right. Rini Sumarno was the Minister of State-owned Enterprises. She was also tasked by Jokowi during his first term as a special envoy to China to procure as much Chinese investment as possible. And so she was instrumental in granting the high-speed rail contract to China when she did back in 2015, I think. She also secured this deposit. Now, I looked into this more closely, finally. I took this respondent's words almost as gospel, and he's not incorrect in what he says to a degree. In fact, the deposit was made on the 16th of September 2015 by the China Development Bank. That graph is on the financial authorities' website. What, and I've done sort of calculations because some of the payment was made in US dollars, some in Indonesian rupiah. What I concluded was that, in fact, Yusuf Kala's uh, group, Group Kala, received 336 uh, million, $857,260. Luhut's company received over 118 million. Why my respondent said it was more than it is, I don't know. Perhaps he knows something that is not being published on the um, financial authorities website. That is one possibility. The other is that he's potentially just forgotten the figures given the fact that there was about a 5-year gap between the interview and the deposit being covered in the news. But it is significant. If the vice president's company is benefiting to that extent, and the coordinating minister of investment and maritime affairs, the company in which he holds 99.98% of shares, is benefiting like that. In one instance alone, that might go some way to telling us why, in fact, Luhut was so intent on permitting Chinese vessels to enter Indonesian maritime territory. Speaking with someone else about this particular deposit, he said, yeah, it is public data, that deposit, and the deposit only made it through after it was determined who would be on the receiving end from our part. And some of those receiving it from our part were companies affiliated with Yusuf Kala and Luhut, for example. And that was done not far along after we solved the Natuna crisis in 2016. But not many people actually want to dig deeper on that. That's like touching on the Lord's coffers. The Lord here is Luhut. He's often referred to as Lord Luhut. And you don't really want to touch the Lord's coffers, right? It's sacrosanct. He's suggesting here that in some way there is a connection between this money landing in the company bank accounts of Yusuf Kala, of Luhut, just as that incident I discussed earlier on the 19th and 20th of March 2016 resolved itself. Um, Whether or not that money, it was deposited in September of 2015, perhaps it only landed in their accounts in March or April of 2016. I don't know. But I have had other conversations with people where they have said, yes, often certain contracts have been granted to China um, in exchange for some respite, shall we say, in terms of Chinese intrusions in Indonesian maritime territory. That is something I need to explore further to get to the bottom of. But there's definitely something going on there, um, which again is why I use this term North Natuna as a bargaining chip. The final point I'm going to make, in terms of this idea of exploitation of Indonesian natural resources and whether or not Indonesia and China might be in the process of striking up a deal. This is something that happened under the former President Jokowi, 15th of May 2023. A regulation was passed ending a 20-year-old ban on the export of marine sand. In the past, Indonesia had sold a lot of sand to countries such as Singapore, which was undertaking a lot of reclamation um, in its own maritime territory, expanding the coast of Singapore. Um, there is talk that also, speaking with colleagues, that Indonesia's Ocean Justice Initiative, for example, this ban has been lifted to enable the government to take sand from certain parts of the archipelago and use it for the construction of the new capital city in East Kalimantan. All that aside, um, the potential impact this will have on the environment and the livelihood of Indonesia's fishermen is pretty stark already. The government has said that they will only allow dredging to take place in areas where natural sedimentation has occurred. So coastal areas and small islands are going to be exempt or off limits. Um, they've also said, as you can see in this article here, which came out just a few weeks ago, and these are just screenshots, so I'm not plagiarizing. I'm citing this, or I'm acknowledging that I've copy pasted it. Um, they're saying that actually we're doing this for the benefit of fishermen because if we don't, and then small islands will build up, and then they won't have as much access to go further out to sea. Um, Sakti Tranggono, the fisheries minister, has said if we see that this is causing environmental harm, then and it's disadvantaging fishermen, will stop it. Um, this article suggests that this is not, in fact, happening. Local fishermen, as you can see in that initial picture, sorry, they're saying Selamatkan Laut Kami, which is protect or save our sea. Tolok tambang pasir laut takalar, so they're saying reject the mining of marine sand. Um, but what this article is saying is that the devastation to the environment is pretty obvious what's going to happen. You can see the Center of Economic and Law Studies in Jakarta is saying that this might generate around 10.9 million in export revenue. Dredging companies might make a significant windfall as well, but the potential losses to fishing communities could amount to what they think is around $77.4 million. And then there's the obvious fact that permitting this, there's a lot of marine carbon storage in Indonesian marine sands, um, and this could, result in serious greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions. The bigger concern here is, I think, and this ties back to China. China has a history. This article, as you can see, September of 2015. China has a history of taking sand and building artificial islands in the South China Sea, which it then militarizes. So you can see on the left, that's how this island was initially. They then build it up and they build a runway on it. So you're militarizing man-made islands in the South China Sea. This is China's way of essentially being able to eventually regulate the regional order of the entire East Asia, Western Pacific bloc. This is their aim. And I think by permitting this is essentially enabling China to further threaten the regional order of the East Asia, Western Pacific bloc. And as I said, Indonesia is potentially enabling this if this also is part of the lifting of the export of marine sands. The other thing is if, people might say, well, how do you know this? There's that on one hand, but China is also very interested in acquiring Indonesian marine sand for things such as quartz sand is great for creating silicon chips, for creating solar panels. And again, this goes towards China trying to reduce its energy deficit. So China has already a keen interest in acquiring Indonesian marine sand. It's just how they're going to use it. And these are two ways that there's already evidence of them doing. So on that note, what I'm going to say is, again, citing Faisal Basri, he made the point um, that his concern was that Indonesia and China, there are clear institutional weaknesses in Indonesia's nascent democratic institutions, and corruption is obviously a huge issue. And he talked about this throughout, and I said to him, okay, I get it, because as you said, if governance is lousy on both sides, both actors are a good fit, right? And he said to me, water and oil don't mix. Only oil and oil, or water with water. Perhaps it's natural law, right? So it's natural law, he thought, that Indonesia and China made convenient transactional bedfellows, so to speak. What I would say, and I'll end with this, Indonesia has no coherent China policy. This is not a controversial position. It simply doesn't have a coherent China policy. a coherent China strategy moving forward. It is a tactical piecemeal approach, primarily driven by economic demands, economic priorities. Um, and it's also elite driven. That is to say, it's personality driven. And with political figures such as Luhut, even President Jokowi, and now potentially President Prabowo, uh, the root of uh, corruption can really be put down to conflicts of interest. And if Indonesia's political elite, business elite have vested interests in the Indonesia-China relationship, this is this does not bode well um, for Indonesia moving forward, for its nascent democracy, and for its um, maritime sovereignty. So I'll leave it there and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Daniel, pour cet exposé. Je dois dire que je ne connais pas grand-chose quant à l'Indonésie et quant aux relations sino-indonésiennes. En ce qui concerne les aspects maritimes, je pense que Frédéric Catois sera certainement plus à même de vous poser des questions. Moi, ce qui m'avait particulièrement intéressé dans l'article que vous avez publié dans Mousson, c'était les éléments qui me permettaient de voir d'une autre façon un certain nombre de faits ou de phénomènes qui pouvaient avoir lieu dans les relations entre la Chine et l'Afrique. Et entre autres, vous avez pris soin de souligner le rôle des acteurs locaux dans le choix de la Chine pour des opérations, qu'elles soient d'infrastructure, d'investissement, etc. Et que ces acteurs locaux agissaient bien souvent pour des raisons plus personnelles que pour des raisons nationales. D'ailleurs, vous venez de le ressouligner avec ces extraits d'une interview, à savoir qu'il y avait un phénomène de corruption réciproque qui a mené le choix de la Chine plutôt que d'un autre pays, même si les autres pays pratiquent eux aussi la corruption. Alors, ce qui est intéressant à partir de ce constat, c'est qu'il y a deux choses. D'abord, il y a une atteinte à la souveraineté économique de ces pays qui se fait qui est le fait de la Chine, mais qui se fait entre autres grâce donc à ces acteurs locaux. Et dans le même temps, on s'aperçoit qu'il y a des problèmes de gestion et d'adéquation des projets chinois à l'environnement local. Je ne veux pas dire que les constructions soient mal faites, je veux dire que les constructions ne sont pas forcément conçues au mieux des besoins de ces pays. Et donc, ce qui m'avait vraiment intéressé de ce point de vue, c'est que je retrouvais dans un autre environnement des problèmes que je rencontrais régulièrement lorsque je regardais ce qui se passait en Afrique. Alors également, il y a une chose que je voudrais indiquer. Vous avez évoqué un, un élément qui est avancé régulièrement par la Chine, qui est la non-intervention. Euh, je, je vous signale au passage que la philosophie chinoise taoïste, pour eux, ne pas faire, c'est aussi faire. Et ce qui veut dire qu'en fait, ce n'est pas parce que l'on proclame la non-intervention que philosophiquement, on est effectivement non-intervenant. Et cela a été clarifié, entre autres, par une grande discussion qui a eu lieu en 2011, où on a inventé des concepts complémentaires comme l'ingérence constructive, c'est-à-dire que l'on peut proclamer la non-intervention et en fait, on justifie toute forme d'ingérence, employant le mot ingérence comme n'étant pas a priori synonyme d'intervention. Donc, de ce fait, tous les textes chinois que vous pouvez voir dans lesquels on prône la non-intervention, dirons-nous, on est beaucoup plus au niveau de la promesse qui n'engage que ceux qui l'entendent et non pas ceux qui l'émettent. Ça, c'est une première chose et ça peut effectivement expliquer aussi un certain nombre de malentendus. Alors, dans votre papier, dans votre exposé, bon, vous avez en partie réactualisé vos données. Vous l'avez souligné, ce papier, le papier initial a été écrit en 2021, voire en 2022 pour une publication en 2023. Vous avez énoncé un certain nombre d'avancées, mais il y a un élément euh, dont vous n'avez pas parlé et peut-être pourriez-vous en dire quelque chose, c'est la place nouvelle prise par l'Indo-Pacifique. Dans votre article, hein, vous évoquez bien l'AUKUS, la relation entre l'Australie, les États-Unis et la Grande-Bretagne, mais vous avez aujourd'hui un certain nombre d'autres acteurs qui sont devenus actifs, que ce soit la France, que ce soit l'Inde, et peut-être que le paysage peut se poser autrement. Et c'est donc la question que je souhaite vous poser ici. Dans quelle mesure le, l'accent mis sur l'Indo-Pacifique pourrait réviser en partie la position de l'Indonésie. Également, il y a aussi une autre question que j'aimerais vous poser, et cette question, elle est vraiment d'une grande actualité, puisque je fais allusion à ce qui s'est passé vendredi dernier dans le Salon Ovale aux États-Unis et de l'humiliation de Zelensky. Euh, à cette occasion, en fait, le fond de l'affaire, c'était l'exploitation de matières premières ukrainiennes par les États-Unis, par des entreprises états-uniennes. Et nous avons vu un président des États-Unis qui traitait un pays en principe, sinon allié, du moins ami, d'une façon absolument indécente. On peut donc se demander si un certain nombre de pays africains, d'autant plus africains ou est-asiatiques, surtout avec la disparition programmée de l'aide américaine, ne vont pas se dire, finalement, si c'est pour être traité ainsi par les États-Unis, ne faut-il pas mieux travailler avec les Chinois qui apparemment ont l'air plus aimables? Ça peut être une grande question, et c'est d'ailleurs la question, la première réaction semi-officielle chinoise qui a eu lieu. Cette réaction, c'est celle du professeur Shen Yi, qui est professeur à l'université de Fudan de Shanghai, qui est un hyper nationaliste chinois, un influenceur, un leader d'opinion, un grand propagandiste. Et pour lui, ce qui s'est passé dans le bureau ovale, c'est tout bénéfice pour la Chine. Alors, par rapport à votre sujet, comment voyez-vous ça? Merci, Daniel.
I'm just wondering if I understood all that because my French is not great. Um, this is with regard to, sorry, who is the great influencer?
Shen Yi, c'est un professeur de
Uh-huh.
Fudan.
Okay.
Hein. C'est la première personne qui
Mm-hmm.
est, c'est semi-officiel, hein. Donc c'est une réaction semi-officielle. Ce n'est pas le gouvernement ni le Parti communiste qui s'exprime, mais c'est quelqu'un qui s'exprime à sa place.
Okay.
Et donc, à considérer que c'était une grande victoire pour la Chine,
Right.
hein, précisément par les réactions que cela pouvait provoquer.
So he's speaking about Xi Jinping. Maybe someone can translate. I'm not entirely following. Sorry.
Well, I shall try to speak in English.
Sorry, Thierry. Uh,
It
Just,
is
just,
very, it is
just,
my broken English. It is very
no.
well. I am speaking about what happened on Friday
Yeah.
in
Okay.
Washington. Zelensky was meeting
Okay.
President
Yeah.
Trump.
Oh, yeah.
On the background, there is a question of minerals, exploitation of
Yeah.
Ukraine
Yeah.
minerals.
Yeah.
And what we have seen, it is America with one friend, friend, friend country,
Mm-hmm.
humiliated. What we might say, that maybe some other countries in Africa as well as in East Asia
Yeah.
might be afraid of such attitude by American and might be saying that it is better to bend on China, which is at least polite. And what I was saying about a professor in Fudan University in Shanghai, whose name is Shen Yi. It is a nationalist, an hyper-nationalist.
Hmm.
It is an influencer,
Hmm.
and it is a well-known propagandist. And when he speaks, it is a way for the Chinese government to say something without saying it. It is a
Okay.
semi-official statement. And for him, what happened in on
Hmm.
Friday is
Hmm.
quite a victory for China.
Okay.
As well, therefore, the question was I was asking, do you think that might be a way to push Indonesia more in the arms of China? My first question was about Indo-Pacific.
Hmm.
Well, I was saying that from your paper has been written in 2021, 2022
Yeah.
to be published in 2020, 2023.
Hmm.
Uh, well, of course, you have been giving some information of what had been happening after that, but there is one point on which you have not been speaking about. It is a question of Indo-Pacific.
Hmm.
Um, from the, the time you have been writing the paper to now, the question of Indo-Pacific has taken another dimension. Uh, for example, uh, France, but not only France, there was also India, has been manifesting, revealing another attitude toward Indo-Pacific. And your paper, you are mainly focusing on AUKUS. And AUKUS, it is not including France, India, and so on. And
Hmm.
it is a change. Um, this change is the change able to uh, make Indonesia a shift from what she has. Well, you should understand. Sorry for my English.
No, no, I understand. No, it's fine. Uh, d- this is the question is that um, in terms of the Indo-Pacific, a lot of the literature uh, suggests that we don't have to worry about the Indian Ocean per se. China is not going to um, try to regulate the regional order of the Indian Ocean or anything that because India is a nuclear power, because India is the world's largest population, it's an up and coming power. The concern is that China will seek to regulate regional power in the East Asia and Western Pacific bloc. We don't actually have to be concerned about it going west of Indonesia. This is one argument. Um, that paper at the time, yeah, I addressed AUKUS because it had just happened. Um, and it was being Australian myself, obviously, it was an interesting development to tear up a contract with Naval Group over the construction of several diesel-powered submarines and then have to pay something like 550 million euros in damages. Um, but I mean, I don't. My concern is that, look, anyone who has been following this longer than I have, their argument is it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. When will China become the regional hegemon? Um, the United States has American primacy, as we would call it, Pax Americana, has been, and this is what this cartoon is the end of my presentation, is that the United States has regulated the regional order of the region since President Nixon went to China in 1972 and struck a deal with Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and said, "We will guarantee you protection from Japan, from the Soviets. We will recognize your government as the legitimate government of China on the condition that you allow us to regulate the regional order here." Obviously, that is potentially changing at the moment. Um, I what is happening in Ukraine? I'm not a Ukraine specialist, so I don't want to talk about it much. I think that what happened last Friday, it still seems like we're in limbo. We don't know what will happen. The United States has said that it can't continue to provide unlimited military aid to Ukraine, that it needs to have something, there needs to be some economic benefit for it. The US has 34 trillion US dollars in debt. It acquires a $2 trillion debt every year. And so it's saying, and Marco Rubio has said, well, we will jointly secure your rare mineral deposits, and that will be part of the deal. And then, therefore, you will have US troops on the ground, but there needs to be something in it for us. Whether or not this Trump administration um, chooses or has no other option, it feels, but to sacrifice the region, Southeast Asia, etc., to Chinese influence, I don't know. I always look to Indonesia because it is, for all intents and purposes, the superpower of Southeast Asia. My argument has been, if it continues to cede maritime territory, for whatever reason, um, elite corruption, um, fast money to finance, for Prabowo to realize his 8% growth in his first term, that's what he's seeking, 8% economic growth, then it really is playing with fire, so to speak. The Philippines is the one country in the region that has a long-standing relationship with the United States, which dates back to obviously its colonial history in the 1951 Defense Treaty. Um, the Philippines, however, their position is, well, Indonesia is a sovereign nation, it can do what it wants. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but um, it's obviously a cause of concern. But people have been critical as well historically of American presence and American involvement. So, um, but now all of a sudden they don't want America to leave certain countries, and they don't want American involvement to stop. So it's a very difficult balance to strike. Yeah, if I've answered your question, I hope I have. I'm not sure I have, but the one thing is Indonesia will just do business with anyone. Okay, they will work with the Chinese. It's really incumbent on as many other countries as possible. If you do not want Indonesia to fall to Chinese influence, um, not indefinitely is not the word. If you don't want Indonesia, sorry, to fall irreparably to to Chinese influence, then it's incumbent upon countries such as the United States, countries in Europe, Australia, to become more involved in the region and specifically Indonesia economically. Um, and so that's why that graph I showed where it's clear Chinese investment exceeds that of many Western countries. And I think the greatest way of defending or maintaining the status quo in Southeast Asia is for other countries to come to the table and to become economically involved and to invest. Um, and so maybe there is something to be said around joint economic, you know, initiatives, collaboration, that there is a security element to that, which actually can benefit the security of sovereign nations, such as Ukraine, such as Indonesia.
Xavier, vous souhaitez intervenir? Oui, attendez une seconde, Frédéric.
Oui, oui, je peux poser quelques questions. Merci, Daniel. J'avais deux, trois questions rapides euh,
Okay.
pour laisser la parole à d'autres ensuite. Euh, dans la conclusion de l'article de Mousson, vous écrivez les IDE chinois sont dangereux. Sont dangereux. Est-ce que vous pouvez expliquer, développer un petit peu? Chinese FDI.
Pardon, j'ai dit quoi? J'ai dit que c'est quoi ce sont dangereux?
Oui,
Les
les idéaux
investissements directs.
d'investissement direct étranger.
Investissement, d'accord.
Voilà. Sinon, j'avais une autre question. Euh, Est-ce que vous trouvez des différences dans les données indonésiennes, FDI, IDE,
Ouais.
et chinoises, entre les données, les bases de données indonésiennes et chinoises? Est-ce qu'il y a de grandes différences dans les chiffres, dans les nombres? Et une autre question, parce que vous ne l'avez pas évoqué, mais c'était pas forcément le sujet. Est-ce que vous avez étudié le land grabbing, l'accaparement de terre, land grabbing, chinois en Indonésie?
Hmm. Chinese land grabbing. Okay.
Voilà.
Okay, merci. Um, why is Chinese investment dangerous? I think for the reasons I have highlighted today. Corruption is one of the biggest threats to the quality of Indonesian democracy. Conflict of interest, political elites benefiting um, at the cost of the Indonesian population, the citizenry. The issue with long-standing or protracted projects such as the Kayan Cascade project, 30 years. Um, I've often, I think in that paper as well, I refer to them as Trojan horses. If you have all these projects with Indonesia, with China, Chinese nationals on the ground, China investing, this potentially compromises Indonesia's impartiality. It compromises its ability to, for example, China has said that reunification with Taiwan before its centenary in 2049 is its primary goal. Um, it then also has said that its core interests are anything in the South China Sea. You are, if you are a truly free and active, as Indonesia claims through its foreign policy, if you are truly free and active, well, you've compromised that impartiality by allowing Chinese investment for that degree, to have that many Chinese interests in your country, like a disproportionate number of compared to other investments by other countries. I think that compromises your ability to pick and choose, to make decisions as you go along. Um, I think that's why it's dangerous. Why there's been this shift. Well, 2013, Xi Jinping signed the Belt and Road Initiative agreement in Jakarta with Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, the then president. And since then, it's gone up. It's part of the Belt and Road Initiative. China's investment globally has increased exponentially. And Indonesia has been one of the recipients and or beneficiaries. Um, Again, yes, some of it is there's a grant element, there is a donation element of this, but a lot of it is debt. China will seek to leverage this debt. And that's one of the potential reasons behind Prabowo's decision to acknowledge China's overlapping claims. Perhaps he can discharge some of this debt by allowing China to exploit the oil and gas reserves in the North Natuna Sea, to have greater access to Indonesian fisheries, to have access to Indonesia's marine sands. With regards to Chinese land grabbing, I'm not sure. Do I write about that in the paper? I don't remember doing that.
No, 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 no.
No?
Not in the paper.
No.
Oh, it's a question.
Oh, I mean, the best way, I actually do quote someone in that paper who says, uh, Indonesia has become the centerpiece of the Indo-Pacific. And once upon a time, people would come there and try to exert their own influence. But now it's really become a geopolitical arena, and countries are coming in and trying to carve up, quite literally, carve up parts of the archipelago and make them have unfettered access to them. Um, and for Australia, Indonesia is this buffer to China. Although recent events with Chinese warships off the east coast of Australia and in the Tasman Sea um, might suggest that Indonesia doesn't provide the greatest of buffers. But yeah, I mean, as you know, Chinese land grabbing, reclamation is the greatest example. They're not even grabbing, they're building their own land and militarizing it. Um, this is, I think, the biggest example of their intent, their expansionist aspirations and intent. I hope that answers the question.
Monsieur l'ambassadeur, vous souhaitiez intervenir. On vous entend pas.
Non.
OK. Non, on ne vous entend pas. Petit problème technique.
Ouais.
Et pendant que j'y pense, vous pourrez m'envoyer la présentation, que je la mette en ligne parce qu'elle
Oui, oui,
elle
bien sûr.
complète l'article, hein.
Oui, bien sûr.
Merci.
Peut-être que quelqu'un a une question, le temps de régler le problème de micro.
Non, apparemment. Ah. Donc, je reviens sur la question de l'investissement pour vous dire qu'il aurait été intéressant de savoir comment les statistiques indonésiennes avaient été établies
Mhm.
pour savoir exactement ce qu'elles incluaient. Par, il y avait un autre aspect du problème, c'est que vous avez pris des flux, flows.
Mhm.
Or, les flux, ils peuvent faire ça.
Mhm.
Donc,
I got the micro.
OK. Euh, il est souvent plus intéressant de regarder les stocks. Et à ce moment-là, vous pouvez vous apercevoir que certains pays qui n'ont pas beaucoup investi aujourd'hui ont beaucoup investi hier
Mhm.
et sont toujours dominants.
Mhm.
Donc, c'est pour ça que regarder les flux, c'est intéressant pour voir ce qui se passe aujourd'hui,
Mhm.
mais ce n'est pas forcément important pour savoir qui a le poids le plus important. Et donc, qui peut éventuellement agir ou influencer le plus. Par ailleurs, selon la façon dont les statistiques sont établies, les bénéfices réinvestis n'apparaissent pas. Or, une entreprise, pour pouvoir continuer à travailler dans un pays, ou dans quel que soit le pays, son pays à elle ou un autre, hein, elle est nécessaire de faire des investissements permanents à partir de ses bénéfices. Les investissements-là, ça correspond à des flux qui viennent d'un pays vers l'Indonésie. Mais ça ne veut pas dire que ça inclut les flux indonésiens vers l'Indonésie. Hein, l'entreprise chinoise qui investit en elle-même, l'entreprise américaine qui investit en elle-même. Donc, ce sont des données qui sont à interpréter avec beaucoup de précaution si on ne sait pas exactement la façon dont elles ont été calculées. Ce sont des données intéressantes, très intéressantes, si on connaît la méthode de calcul.
Okay. I mean, these are government statistics.
Yeah,
So,
of course. And I'm not saying they are bad. I'm just saying that their meaning is not so easy to understand.
no, of
If
course.
you know the exact meaning of, so if I don't know the way they have been calculated.
I mean, yeah, they're official government statistics, whether or not I don't know the method how they've been calculated. As I said, it's really difficult to acquire or obtain the methodology of how this is done, how they calculate the statistics, even in government documents. Um, yeah, and as I said, some of it is conflicting. You'll get some sources telling you one thing and others telling you another. The other problem is, as I said, they will round trip. China round trips. That is, it pays for things, invests in Indonesia via Singapore, via Hong Kong, to distract from the fact that it is investing large amounts, significant amounts of money in Indonesia. Other than that, I'm not I'm not a mathematician or economist.
Well, you know, the consequence of that is you may have a political analysis, but you can't have an economic.
Oh, indeed.
And therefore, the meaning of your analysis is quite different from that point of view.
It's still big picture, and these are official statistics from the Indonesian government. And having conducted interviews as I did, they confirmed my suspicion that China is the number one investor in Indonesia. And
In
this was,
terms of flows,
yeah,
investment flows,
yeah.
not investment stock.
Both. I mean, how do you distinguish? What is investment stock? What is?
No, it is, I should say, the addition of historic investment till today.
Well, I mean that shows you in 1 year, last year.
That is what happened in 1 year,
Yeah.
and it is flows, investment flows. And this year might be very high for one country, but the following one it might be very low.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, but Chinese investment in Indonesia has been consistently high, I would think. I mean, it's increased over the years. So this is the point. Since 2013, it has increased significantly.
As far
But
as
that,
what would be very interesting to know is
Mm.
whether in US enterprises, which has been investing in Indonesia
yeah.
10 or 20 years ago till today,
Yeah.
they have a stock of investment. This stock of investment is not every year being renewed.
Right. Sure.
Use the benefits, and you won't be able to see from that kind of statistic what has been really investing using benefits.
Yeah. You're right. But all I can really work with is what the government publishes, short of, in investigating all US businesses' investments in Indonesia. Um, the thing that came through in that interview with Faisal Basri again, I didn't talk about this, but he said that he met with a colleague at the US Embassy not long before I interviewed him. And this American embassy official confirmed that China was the #1 investor in Indonesia.
Ok.
Mm.
Monsieur l'ambassadeur, si le micro
Yes.
marche.
Do you hear me now?
I do.
No problem.
Yes. Well, I had three legal points or legal political points.
Okay.
Well, first, you didn't mention the point of the arbitration between Philippines and China from 2016, July 2016.
Yeah.
And in this connection, you are all the time talking of sovereignty. There are two types of sovereignty between the Indonesian claims and the Chinese claims. China wants the South China Sea as a territorial sea, and they are claiming this for the last 50, 60 years, by much more force the recent years. But already in the around 2000, they were all the time claiming this South China Sea as a territory, whereas Indonesia only wants it as a fishing zone and as a continental shelf for exploitation, so far as I see it. And the third point in this connection was Philippines for a certain time didn't exploit this arbitration decision from 2016 under Duterte, and now they are forcing again their claim. Is there any connection between the Philippines now insisting and Indonesia being more lenient with China? That was for this legal point. I wanted to come back to the point Soviet Union or Russia and China. During the weekend after the famous clash of last Friday, I came back to an old connaissance of mine, which is Vernon Walters, who was the pivotal point behind the approach of Nixon to Mao Zedong in the 70s. And there was a lot of sayings that Trump is reversing the matter and trying to look for an arrangement with Russia in order to have pressure on China. But that is, of course, a bit beyond the point between Indonesia and China. But I looked into the memoirs of Vernon Walters, where he explained the change of sides of Nixon in the 70s. And normally, you know this under Kissinger's name, but actually the person behind was Vernon Walters, who was a counsel for 9 American presidents, which is quite a lot. Yeah, but it was his legal point, which I raised first. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled in 2016, as you said, that China's 9-dash line has no claim, has no basis in international law. Indonesia was not a party to that claim. At the time, Indonesia's position was to not even be a claimant in the South China Sea, because the position was we're not going to indulge spurious claims that violate international law, that violate UNCLOS. Is there anything else you wanted me to say about that particular decision, or?
No, but it is difference between the 2 points of sovereignty. The United States, even under Trump, is going ahead with the point of freedom of navigation operations, because if you have the 9-dash line as a real territory, the point of innocent passage is quite different. If you have it only as an economic zone, it's high seas beyond the question of fisheries and exploitation of mineral resources.
Okay. Sorry, is that a statement or a question?
It's a question because the Chinese side was very firm on this territorial claim. And if they accept that there are overlapping claims between Indonesia and China, it's also a concession on the Chinese side to say that, because up to now they were very firm on this issue.
Okay. I don't know enough about this distinction. I'll need to look into it. I mean, innocent passage and these types of things is one of the reasons the United States never ratified UNCLOS, because of these gray areas, and the potential consequences. But yeah, okay, I will look into this. The change under the Philippines, yes, Duterte and Xi had a far stronger relationship. If you look at investment from China in the Philippines, it goes up and down. It's quite low under Marcos at the moment. I believe it was quite low under Arroyo as well. Even when Chinese investment in Indonesia, even when Chinese investment in the Philippines has increased, they have never granted the Philippines investment at a good rate. I can't remember the figures precisely, but yeah, China and the Philippines do not have the same economic relationship. It was at its strongest under Duterte, that is for sure. The fact that we've seen these instances, the resupply of the second Thomas Shoal and the flare-ups last year, and the attacks on Philippine vessels, there seems to be a connection, yes, between the nature of the China-Philippines bilateral relationship. It's nowhere near as strong as it was under Duterte, but it's never been, even under Duterte, as strong as it's been with Indonesia. And I think in large part that has to do with Indonesia's colonial history, being aligned, obviously a colony of Spain and then the United States, and then this 1951 defense treaty. So, which is why I say that the Philippines is kind of the West's almost, it's the surest thing the West has in Southeast Asia is the Philippines in terms of an ally. And that is reflected in the fact that the Philippines has never had a particularly strong relationship with China, especially as of late. What this might mean in terms of Indonesia becoming closer to China, what this means for the Philippines is interesting. I posed this very question to the Philippine Foreign Secretary at an event a few weeks ago at Chatham House, and he deflected the question and said, Indonesia is a sovereign nation and can make decisions as and how it sees fit. When I said, do you find this concerning with developments with Prabowo and Xi? He just said, no, that's up to them. So I think deep down he would find it very concerning, but he didn't acknowledge that. Does that answer the questions? I'm not sure.
Yes,
I
thank you.
will look further into this innocent passage issue. This is interesting, this distinction.
It's not only innocent passage, it's quite a lot of other questions. Well, if you look into the American program of freedom of navigation operations, which is discussed quite a lot also in Paris think tanks, it's quite interesting because France has a much higher stake in Indian Ocean than other European countries have.
No doubt, understandably, yes. Something I need to investigate further.
Okay. Some questions? Anyone? No questions? Bien, bah écoutez, Daniel, je vais vous remercier de cette intervention et j'espère donc que nous pourrons continuer à l'avenir à discuter ensemble.
Oui.
Hein, si, en ce qui me concerne, il y a des petits problèmes d'élocution. Et donc, nous vous remercions les uns et les autres et à bientôt.
Bientôt. Merci beaucoup, Thierry.
Merci Daniel.
beaucoup à vous.
Merci beaucoup.
Bonne journée.
Bonne journée.
À vous aussi.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.